Okay, yeah, thanks, Wendy. So my name's Jamie Moore. I'm a postdoc working with Peter Smith, who's already been talking a moment ago, and Gabrielle Durant, who's a professor of social statistics at Southampton. I'm actually, I believe, the first English project, aren't I, for the ADRC, so ADRC 001. What I work on quickly, I'll come into this a little bit more, is basically monitoring survey data collection. I've changed the talk a little bit from what I wrote in the abstract, partly because I found out Peter was talking first, so I could get away with some stuff, and also to make it a little bit more immediate. So I'm going to talk about some research, and I'm going to talk about the experiences and reflections afterwards. Right, so as I say, we're interested in the impacts of survey non-response on dataset quality. In particular, one here is non-response bias. If your survey instrument doesn't measure what you think it measures, it's not going to be much good. One way in which this can occur is basically if the non-respondents are different from the respondents, because then you're likely to end up with a bias. It's going to be different from the population value for something. The issue, though, is assessing non-response biases. Those two are the wrong way around. The major problem with this is you haven't got any information on the non-respondents. They haven't responded to the survey. So what do you do? In a few cases where we have actually managed to get some data on this, the obvious indirect measure is the survey response rate. You'd think if you had a 90% response rate, you'd pretty well cover the population quite well. Various meta-analyses have shown this is not actually the case. Those 10% could be seriously important, and you could end up with a value that seriously deviates from the population value. So you can probably see where this is leading, given that Peter was talking about linked data. What we do, Peter talked about the 2001 iteration of this, is we collect data on the sample frame from the census. Basically, we link the households that we go to in surveys, find out who's in the household, and find out about those people, whether or not they respond or not. There's a particular study on this which Peter mentioned earlier, which is the Office for National Statistics 2011. It's called the Census Non-Response Link Study. So I've been using this data. What we do quickly, we quantify bias risks in terms of variation in the probability of responding to the survey across different subgroups of the population. So in effect, what we do here, we use particular methodologies called representativeness indicators. The one in particular I'm going to talk about here is the coefficient of variation of response propensities. So basically, if you think, let's talk about, I don't know, an attribute variable age that we've divided into three categories. Right, so if category A over there, category B there, category C there, if you've all got the same response propensity, then that data set is going to be pretty representative of your sample. Yeah? What I'm looking at is see if they're not representative. So what we do with this is basically, it's as simple as that. It's a logistic regression model using the census data to predict response propensities, given that you know whether somebody's responded or not. Then all you do is take the standard deviation of the predicted values from that logistic regression model, divided by the overall response rate, and you've got an indicator of data set representativeness. Yeah? Now, in this particular thing, this is very much in the context of the way that the ONS collect data. So if you think about it, you're doing telephone interviews or face-to-face interviews, you don't get somebody at the first call every time. Often with these surveys, they take up to 20 calls to get people. So an additional question here, given these repeated interview attempts, and the reason actually for doing this practically, is we monitor it over what we call the call record, so over the data collection period, to basically see if we can reduce the number of attempts you make to interview people without affecting survey data set quality. Here, in this short talk, we've actually got more surveys than this. I'll present results from the labour force survey, which is one of the major ONS surveys looking at employment and things like that. I'll talk about the numbers in that sample a little bit in a moment. Okay, some very quick results. As I say, this is the labour force survey. This particular iteration, I should say, the data set is about 3 months either side of the 2011 census. The idea being there that the people that we got in the census in that household are likely to be there when they were asked whether they wanted to do the interview or not. This particular iteration of it, this is only the first wave of the LFS as well. There are 5 waves in this as well. So get the idea of just how many attempts there are to interview people in these sorts of surveys. It's 34,000 people being interviewed just in those six months. Now, if we look at the final response rate, it's 68.3%. Now, going back to those indicators, those representativeness indicators I talked about earlier in the logistic regression model, what I did, I fitted a logistic regression model with the census data on the sex of the people in the household, age, highest qualification, activity last week, and tenure. And basically, I know whether they respond or not because I've got the survey outcome. Now, this particular graph down here, 2 lines on it. The blue line is the response rate against call rate, against call number. Call number's on the x-axis, the response rate, and when we get to it, the overall coefficient of variation in response propensities in the y-axis. Now, the blue line is the response rate. You can actually see, over the call record, it increases very quickly and then flattens out. I'll tell you right now, actually, you go beyond call 16 and they're still making calls there, but they get no responses whatsoever. Now, if we look at this coefficient of variation in response propensities, which is the estimate of survey data set quality, if you remember, what we see is that almost shows an inverse relationship with that and very rapidly flattens out again, which implies that we've actually got potential to stop data collection early and make a saving there. Now, we talk in survey methodology about design phase capacity points. Basically, what this is a particular method of data collection. So at this point, turning up at someone's house, knocking on the door and hoping they're going to answer and do the interview. That would be considered the design phase. A phase capacity point is the point in there, within that design phase, where data set quality is not going to get any better. You've reached phase capacity. Now, I've calculated these dead simply. All this is I've taken the CV, I've taken the minimum value there, and said, right, okay, so where can I stop there? Where it's within 0.01 of that value, 0.02, 0.05. Now, I should notice this CV isn't just an abstract indicator either. It can actually be shown to indicate the maximal absolute relative non-response bias in any of the survey variables. Basically, if the survey variable is 100% correlated with those, then this will be the measure of the bias. Now, if you look at these and you look at the way they're calculated, we can actually stop a lot earlier than we're currently doing when we're collecting this data. At 0.02, we can stop at call 6. Now, I'll come back to the saving about that in a moment. I'll also note here that the points are earlier when the threshold is increased. That's pretty obvious. Now, I can see what you're all thinking here. What real relevance does this bear to the survey variables? Obviously, this is about the census variables, and what we're looking at here is a larger idea of having a representative data set, which means that those survey responses will actually reflect population values. But let's just have a look at a few survey variables. Hopefully I'll press the right button this time. Right, okay, so these are just a few, 3 of the survey variables we got. So age, highest qualification, and the top right-hand corner, activity last week. Now, all I've done here is an equivalent to what I've been doing with these representativeness indicators. And obviously, I don't know the actual non-response bias in this, so what I'm looking at is the change in the estimate. So all I've done is calculate a % difference from the final data set value and just track that across the call record. And as you can see, in each of these various categories, I'm not going to go through, there's lots of them there, very rapidly, almost you might say equivalent to what you saw on the previous slide, you see very little change in your estimates. Now, if we calculate similar PC points here, and I'll say similar, I'm not going to say entirely equivalent, because what I'm talking about is a 2% change in your final estimate, or within 2% of your final estimate. What I've done here is I've just picked a few covariate categories here. If you think about it, what you would be doing if you were trying to improve data set quality, which is obviously the other side of data set optimization, is you would be probably looking at those categories that are underrepresented in the data set. You're not worried about the ones where you've got too many of them. You want to bump up the numbers you've got where you haven't got very many. So if we just look at these few categories here, age, 16 to 54, basically the working population, they're actually underrepresented in that data set. You can see up in the top left-hand corner. People with no qualifications are underrepresented in that data set. People with GCSEs only are underrepresented in that data set. Similarly, the employed are. They're not at home that much, so they're a bit difficult to get in touch with. Now, if we calculate those PC points for those, we can actually see that they're actually pretty well similar to that overall CV PC point from the previous slide, which was at call 6. So actually, the call 6 thing's a little bit conservative. But the key to this is if you calculate the number of calls you're going to save by doing this, which I've done, it's a 7.6% call saving. Now, remember what I said about numbers here. This is an interview, there's 34,000 people in this data set alone. This is 6 months of a 12-month data collection that they do every year. It's only one wave. We're talking about huge amounts of numbers here. Massive savings to be made here. So, given that, I've kind of showed you the advantages of working with linked data, and if I dare say it, working at the ADRC. Let's just talk about a few. Oh, and I should actually say there that, funny enough, I presented that at the ONS last summer. It was about 2 weeks after they'd been told that they had to cut 10% off their survey budget. Suddenly I was boy wonder. But let's go back to some experience and reflections, because it does tie into this sort of thing. Peter's talked about the application process. There's endless form filling in this 3 times over, because you have to do technical versions, you have to do layman's versions, and they'll probably come up with something in between as well. You do end up banging your head against the brick wall a lot of the time, but you can actually get there. They do their best for that. Obtaining the data, now that's a little bit more taxing. Yes, they may say that they'll give you the data, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to turn up in a timely manner. Now, a little bit about my background. I actually worked at the Office for National Statistics for 3 years. It's kind of poachers and gamekeepers with this, if you see what I mean. I'm aware of the way it works down there. The immediate thing is risk aversion. You've got somebody sat in an office there who could potentially go to prison if you do something wrong with this. That's the way the law works. I think you could potentially go if something went wrong, couldn't you? Yeah. So, and you know, most people who work at the ONS aren't as assessed as Peter, so I mean, they're a lot more worried about it. So there is that manic risk aversion down there. They're really scared that something's going to go wrong with it, and it's something that will go wrong 5 years down the line. And they'll be happy doing their lives, and there'll be a knock on the door, and there'll be a copper waiting for them. That's what they're worried about. Second thing is, as I'm sure anybody who's dealt with government departments knows, the wheels of government turn very, very slowly at times. A few things you have to talk about there. One thing I run into regularly, most of the civil service move jobs every 2 years, which means that basically you will phone up one day and find that the person you've been talking to for the last 6 months is no longer there. And they've done no handover whatsoever. So you have to start all over again. Get used to this, it does happen, unfortunately. Potential lubricants to make it a little bit better? Well, I think a couple have been touched upon. Mutual benefits. As I say, this lot suddenly got a lot more excited and were a lot more friendly to me when they realised what I could do for them. So maybe you want to consider that. The alternative is reciprocity. I'll do something for you if you do something for me. That might well get you the data as well. One thing I would say about this, Peter may well shout at me on the train on the way home about this. What I would say, sorry.
Say it.
Take the lead yourself when it comes to getting the data. Keep a very close eye on it, because you're going to end up knowing more about it than most of the people who are on the other end of the phone. What I will also say with that is, if you keep on digging with your government departments, somewhere in some broom cupboard where nobody's talked to them for 20 years, you will find somebody who's an expert on this data set. Unfortunately, generally, it's down to you to find them. When you do find them, cherish them, because they're going to know more about it than anyone. And the additional thing is, when I've eventually found those people, what I've generally found is they prefer to talk to people like us, because there's somebody in the middle who doesn't have a clue what they're talking about, so it's easy to talk to us. So that's another bit of advice. Finally, working with the data. So Peter's mentioned about we work in secure research environments. If you haven't worked in a secure research environment, and I'll say my background's in biology, so I never did until about 3 years ago, it can be a bit strange. The idea of doing the analysis 30 times until you get it right, you're not going to be able to do that. You got to do something. You know, remember when they taught you how to do research, about research planning and planning what you were going to do rather than doing it ad hoc? Probably an idea to do it in this case. Because you may well be travelling. I have to travel 15 miles every day to get my data. So you don't want to spend that much time down there, if you see what I mean. So that probably covers the awareness of constraints of the environment and efficient research practice. Key to it as well, communication with the support officers. There are going to be people looking after this. I've done it in the past. I will be doing it very soon at the ADRC as well. Now, you might get a bit lucky if you've got someone like me. Most of those people, unlike us, they've got lives. You know, if you try and get a clearance out, you know, they might have families, children, you know, things like that. Key point being, whilst you or I might well be sat there at 8 o'clock at night on Friday looking at data thinking, great, that's my result, they're not going to be very happy with you if you ask them at 5 o'clock on a Friday if they can release it, because they've got to do all the disclosure control. Just think about the people you're working with as well, because it makes an awful lot easier if you get on with those people. All right, thanks for listening.
Thanks. very much, Jamie. I think we've got time for one quick question, if somebody's got a burning question.
No?
So, yep, at the back there.
Thank you very much. All this data sounds fantastic. However, is there a list of all the possible variables which you hold on everyone so I can see whether it's useful to me?
So I think ultimately the idea is that from several people or several groups. I mean, Louise can probably tell you more about question bank and things like that and the variable list that the UKDS have got. The ONS do similar things, not on the same level. I would actually have to say, I think with ONS data, go to the UKDS website. But what you do have, you know, all these surveys have got user guides and things like that. Unfortunately, you are going to have to dig through it, but certainly with government surveys, you can find things like that.
Do you want me to just add on the admin stuff? So there's a catalogue of all the surveys we hold, all the ONS surveys, we hold pretty much all of them. There's variable list for all them. But for the admin stuff, the Admin Data Centre are producing metadata records of as much detail as they can. So if they can glean information, which is always sometimes quite hard to get, there's a lot of detail there.
Yeah.
So they're actually really nice pieces of work on what might be available.
And perhaps I just add, as we get access to data, one of the conditions of getting the data is that we'll produce a metadata and make those publicly available.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a sort of a chicken and egg in some senses. We need researchers, and there are some working pioneering projects that are getting data, and then once we have the data, we'll be able to provide the catalogues. As mentioned, sometimes snippets or partial parts of these administrative data sets are out there in various forms. And there was, before the ADRN set up, the Administrative Data Liaison Service. So there is a list of the sorts of data that you can request and some information.
It's great. I think we're out of time, but thanks very much to Jamie.
Just say one more thing. Sorry, Wendy.
Okay.
What I've talked about here, if you think about it, right, I'm trying to sell myself a little bit here, and what we do, you can do exactly the same to evaluate linked data sets. You know, because you think, like Peter said, you're not going to have 100% linkage, but you're going to have a sample data. Your sample is going to be on one side, and you're going to have data about them. All these methods are usable for linked data sets as well. So if anybody wants to chuck any my way, I can probably do it.